Hello, my name is John Paulson, and I hold lay ordination in a contemporary Zen Buddhist lineage and an apprentice teacher. And so I serve as a teacher here at Mindful Heart Buddha Sangha in Evansville, Indiana. Yeah, so Buddhism does not have a central creation narrative like the Judeo-Christian tradition or other traditions. Now, as the teachings and practices of the Buddha started to spread out of their historical areas in modern India into other countries and cultures, it always mixed with native traditions. And so there are some expressions of Buddhism that might have some types of creation narratives, but there's not a central creation narrative to Buddhism. In fact, when the Buddha was asked questions like that, such as, is there a God? Is there a soul? Is there a heaven? Questions that we might consider to be very theological. It's always said that he would keep a noble silence. He just wouldn't answer them. And historically would say, I teach one thing, suffering and the cessation of suffering. Like a lot of traditions, there's a variety of practices. And those can be formal practices such as rituals, days of observance. They can be community practices, but also individual practices. So there's a significant variety. But the main focus of Buddhist practice is how do we increasingly, more consistently bring this into our lives and make it come alive in our lives in a way that benefits us and others. I would say that that is the technology of presence and awareness training. And that's a fancy way of saying meditation. So meditation is a central part of Buddhist practice, but that term, meditation, is a very general umbrella term that can mean a lot of different things in a lot of different traditions. So within the Buddhist tradition, we have a series of practices that help people to become more aware of their present moment experience, and especially experiences that often go unnoticed. And unfortunately, when they go unnoticed, they tend to be playing out old scripts that create and perpetuate our suffering. So we have these practices and these contemplations which help people to pay more attention to their present moment experience. What's actually happening now, so that I can more skillfully recognize and respond to those in a way that is going to be helpful, as opposed to reenacting or perpetuating those old responses, those old scripts. And so we sometimes do that as a group practice together, but then also as an individual or solo practice. So it's one of the, almost like going to the gym. This is a consistent practice that helps you to strengthen that awareness of tuning in, paying attention to what's going on. And there's a significant variety of practices. Most people, when they look at Buddhist practice or a statue of the Buddha, see people in a seated position, and that's typical. But important thing about that is that it's really more about what are you doing with your attention. We often will sit in particular ways that are just trying to make it easier to not get so distracted and pay attention to now. I say that because there's no essential way that someone must sit, or we're not satellite dishes that we have to tune our body in a particular way to get the principle. But we have these formal practices that will help us, so that you, by sitting more upright, and let's say if the object of awareness for our practice is the breath, well, we want to sit in a way, as one of my teachers says, that promotes a sense of nobility and stability. Nobility is an odd sounding word, but it's nobility of purpose. We sit just like the Buddha sat. And that's an important thing in our tradition, because the Buddha was a human being, just like all of us, and through great effort came to these realizations, and then through great compassion shared them with others so that all might benefit. wow, so we're trying to engage in that same practice. And we talk about waking up the Buddha nature in all of us. So we sit in a way that reflects that noble commitment that I want to wake up to suffer less in my life, and I hope that others will benefit as well. And then stability. So we tend to sit in a way that provides a sense of settledness or foundation. If people sit on the floor, they're close connected to the earth, or I can feel this chair supporting me, which allows my back to be upright. And so the back being upright allows my chest to be open, where especially if the object of awareness is the breath, that makes it easier to focus on. It's easier to feel settled. My shoulders can fall away from my ears so that I'm not holding tension, which is common for most of us working at our computers. And you allow the neck just to be supported. And then we have the systematic instructions about what to do with our attention, ways of concentrating on whether it's the breath or sounds around us, thoughts that are going through your mind, so that way we come to a greater recognition of these patterns, and it gives us an increased ability to not act them out and to actually cultivate patterns or habits of inner experience that are going to serve us better. And ultimately though, so we either it's in a group setting or individually, we sort of have formal practice where maybe you sit for a particular amount of time, you're focused on a particular activity, but the main goal is how do we take that off of the cushion, we say, like, talking about the cushions that's on the floor. How do you take your practice off the cushion and bring it into your life moment by moment in a way that is going to help you to wake up? Yeah, so that sense of service, and if we think about it as you drop a pebble in a pond, and then we see these radiating circles out, service really takes that form. So maybe within particular Buddhist traditions, there's actually sort of like some service that comes up within the community, especially if you start off with monastics. And so there's a very significant focus on work practice and service practice, but that's really just seen as a microcosm of how to try to live our lives. Mm-hmm. So how do you take the practices historically beyond the monastery or beyond the Dharma center? How do you bring them into the moment-to-moment interactions in your lives with others? So there's not necessarily, like some other traditions, there's not necessarily a list of here are the 3 things that you're called upon to do. It's really more like the Buddhist teachings are saying, hey, this is something that's really important. It's something that often gets overlooked because when we get distracted and confused by not seeing our circumstances clearly, we forget that this is a priority, and then we drift away from it, we don't do it. So let's get back to how do we see the importance and significance of this and find a way to skillfully express it in your life. I think there's a lot of common misconceptions. I think the ones that always stick out the most to me is that in order to study or engage with these teachings and practices, that you must be a Buddhist. And so we could playfully say, well, what does that even mean? It really is. So there's this idea of, at times, that we see it as in opposition to other faith and wisdom traditions, other religions. And Buddhism has some really important and interesting, and I find beneficial dynamics that doesn't really call on one to declare themselves of this particular faith and forsake all others. So, for example, here at Mindful Heart, we're a very eclectic group, and we have people who come who would identify as Buddhist. We have people who come who are Christians that are also cultivating these practices in their Christian lives. We have people that are not religious at all. That might identify as atheist or humanist. And so there's nothing when they walk through the door that says, you must, accept this identity. So I think that one of the common misconceptions is that you must convert. Now, do people, kind of in a way sort of take on a Buddhist identity and kind of make some commitments, do precepts, and really see it that way? Yes. So, but I think it's a little different than some other faith and wisdom traditions we're used to thinking to in that way. Another common sort of misconception that I see is this sort of sense that, especially like when, it's funny when you read about your heritage, like in other books, like I even will look at like, world religious text, and you read the part about Buddhism, and it says, Buddhism says that all life is suffering, and suffering comes from desire. And you're like, who in the world would want to study that? It's a very nihilistic and detached presentation of Buddhism, and I think that unfortunately that's still a misconception that you see. And the one thing I would counter that is that look at most of the living examples of awakening in Buddhist teachers in the world, and even just look at the statues. They're gently smiling. Now obviously there's part of the tradition does invite us to think about suffering in the world and in our lives and what causes it and how do we be more awake to that. And we do cultivate a sense of non-attachment, not detachment, but a sense of how do you navigate the world in a way that helps you to not suffer as much. But it's not this sense of everything's horrible, just cut everything out. That's a common sort of misconception. Now, the opposite, though, I think that a final misconception is that, people all of a sudden start to believe, oh, well, if you're a Buddhist, you're always gentle and you're always blissed out and you're always quiet, like you're just hovering off the floor a little bit. It's understandable why people are often drawn to that, because a lot of times people, including me, have been drawn to the practices because of a lot of struggle and suffering in our lives in our past. And so we think, oh, I want that, where I just won't feel anything, or I'm always blissful, or I'm always calm. Part of the teachings is, how do I wake up to a clear realization of phenomena in a way that liberates me from perpetuating suffering? So that is the main goal. And that doesn't mean that we can't be happy or that we're not going to get angry, but it's about how do we increasingly notice that and respond to it in skillful ways that are not perpetuating our trap. So unfortunately, if you come and if you practice, you're not going to develop special abilities. It's not that you're never going to get upset, but we get increasingly better at working with that in ways that don't harm ourselves or others. Yeah, luckily and amazingly, we have wonderful resources in the area, which has not always been the case. When I was first exploring these practices a couple decades ago, it was harder, but now we have a lot of resources. And so one of the best resources that we have is our public library. The EVPL has some phenomenal resources, including books, a large collection of audio books, both physical ones that people can still check out and through the streaming app. Here in Evansville, is that obviously we have our group, Mindful Heart Buddha Sangha. We are not connected to a particular type or lineage of Buddhism, and we're not connected to a particular teacher. So we tend to be a very eclectic group that pulls from a lot of different traditions within Buddhism. We consistently meet on Sundays at 6 o'clock for group practice, where we will sit in meditation for a period of time, and then whoever is leading will share aspects of the teachings. Throughout the year, we have some different events, periods of retreat, which are extended periods of practice, or sometimes we will offer some foundational classes. So there's lots of different events, but our consistent time is Sundays at 6 o'clock. In addition to our group here in Evansville, There's also Kunzang Choling of Evansville, which is another wonderful group. That group is connected to a particular teacher and tradition, and it is a Tibetan Sangha. So they cultivate an expression of the Buddha Dharma from an intentional Tibetan framework. The leader there, Alan McCoy, is a phenomenal teacher, and they meet out of Evansville Power Yoga. So at least right now, at the time of us talking, we are the two established Buddhist communities or Sanghas here in Evansville. And I think something that is a characteristic of both our groups is that we want to be helpful. So when people have questions or if they're curious about the practice, we get people who will email the group, people who will come, and one of our commitments is to try to help people to discover what is going to be best for them. And I think that's an important thing about Buddhism, is that there's lots of different approaches, but it's really about finding the one that is going to be the best for you. So it's not what's the best approach, it's what's going to help me to realize these practices in my life. A little bit beyond Evansville is that close to Evansville is that there are several practice centers in Bloomington, Indiana, several that are Tibetan, and there's also a Japanese Zen center that's there. And there are several different traditions that also have practice settings in Louisville. So even within Evansville and the immediate southern Indiana, we have some wonderful assets.